Get Rich Education is brought to you by Norada Real Estate and International Coffee Farms.
Welcome to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold, giving you information and ideas on the investment that has turned more ordinary people into millionaires and billionaires than anything else, and can provide you with more wealth and happiness than you ever thought possible. Now, here's your host, investor, entrepreneur, business owner, and educator, Keith Weinhold.
Welcome to Get Rich Education. This is episode 70. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Today, we're chatting with the Yale University educated Frank Gallinelli. He teaches real estate investing analysis to graduate students at Columbia University in New York City. And today, he's going to be your professor too in this class with free tuition, if you will. Frank is also a popular real estate investing author. Here's hoping that you've lived an abundant week. I'm taking it easy this week as I'm recovering from knee surgery. Now, I knew something didn't feel quite right in my knee for months, even though I've been running, biking, and exercising on it all this while, even surfing on it, and even climbing Panama's highest peak on this knee. But, I soon found that rest alone was not making the pain go away, so my doctor repaired my torn meniscus. So I'm in kind of a slack-jawed state now, but I should soon be back and better than ever. It looks like stationary biking in 7 to 10 days and running in 6 to 8 weeks. Now, when I talk to novice real estate investors, I often hear some really awful reasons for why they own a certain income property, for why they have that in their portfolio right now, okay? Now, you can go ahead and put whatever you want into your portfolio, okay? Just understand how you're financially limiting yourself and be aware of the opportunity cost of not purchasing something with a profitable income stream. Right? Something that is actually calculated based on fundamentals and bought strategically. If you want to build an income stream that creates financial freedom and that's your goal, then do you still want to own that rental property that you've had forever just because your aunt used to own it or your brother used to own it and it's simply easy to hold on to because you already have it? I mean, geez, hobbies are one thing, but this is an investing show. I mean, boy, if you would just shift that equity into a more profitable property, maybe it would produce enough monthly income for you that it would cover professional management and produce a greater income stream at the same time. Or did you decide to hold on to that rental home in that town where you used to attend college simply because it brings back some collegiate memories or something, okay? I mean, people typically invest for the production of income. If that's true, then you don't really care about a beautiful building or sentimental reasons either, okay? Too much pride of ownership can have an opportunity cost. And for what reason? Just so you can brag to your friends about a pretty property? Not a good reason. Me, I save pretty for the home that I live in. All right? Me personally, in my Class C multifamily investment niche, where I have quite a few units, I provide housing that's clean, safe, affordable, and functional. Those four things. As soon as I do beautiful, I start to lose. Now, when you go to purchase that income-producing property, you've got to assume that seller pro forma, which are those properties' operating numbers supplied from the seller side, you've got to assume that they are a lie, okay? That's a way to approach it. Then you have to determine if any of those assumed lies are true, all right? That's your job. That's due diligence. Buying right is key, so let's talk about it with our guest. Today's guest is president and founder of Real Data Software that provides investment and development analysis application for income property investors like you and to developers. He's the author of several books, including the best-selling What Every Real Estate Investor Needs to Know About Cash Flow. That book has over 100,000 copies sold. And by the way, I have that book on the desk right next to me. I don't know why. Whenever I have a popular author on, if I have his hard copy book, I always bring it right here with me for the interview. This guest is an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia University Graduate School. He teaches real estate investment analysis. And he's also the creator of an online video course called The Introduction to Real Estate Investment Analysis. You can find that yourself at learn.realdata.com, and that's based on his writings and teaching. Welcome to Get Rich Education, Frank Gallinelli.
Well, thank you for having me, Keith. It's a delight to be with you today.
Yeah, it's a delight to be with you. Let our listeners know where you're located.
I'm in Southport, Connecticut, so we're kind of on the shore of Long Island Sound on the Connecticut side of it.
All right, very good. Well, now we know that in residential real estate investing, the income stream just doesn't matter at all, right? I mean, we want something with beautiful Mediterranean architecture or perhaps a Greek revival style with all the embellishments and the tall columns and everything, right? That's what we're looking for here.
Absolutely, Keith. Just give me a pretty building and I'm in heaven. Forget about the cash flow and all that stuff. I don't really want any of that. I just want a nice thing to look at.
Yeah, I don't want passive income either.
No, forget it.
In case I would sometime, maybe we can talk about how to get it, though. So tell us about why you developed Real Data's real estate investment software.
Well, that goes back several decades, I think 34, 35 years or more. So this may antedate the age of some of our listeners today. But I was involved in trying to acquire a piece of commercial property. And serendipitously enough, I had also just acquired this newfangled gadget called a personal computer. And I was trying to figure out what to do with it. One of the things I got with it was also something that was brand new, and that was called a spreadsheet program. And this was before Multiplan or Excel or any of these things. As a matter of fact, the operating system, for those of you who have tinkered around long enough, before Windows, you'll realize, of course, there was something called MS-DOS. Well, the computer I was trying to work on was before even MS-DOS. This thing, I think, was heavier than a riding lawnmower, but had less horsepower. And the data disks looked like, medium-sized pizzas. But in any event, I was trying to do this analysis, and I figured, well, let's see if I can figure out also, kind of kill two birds with one stone here, figure out how this computer and this spreadsheet thing works. I'd been familiar, of course, using paper and pencil spreadsheets. I had learned the investment analysis trade, if you will, at the knee of one of the founders of the Realtor CCIM program back in the 70s when I was a commercial real estate sales manager. So I figured, well, let's see if we can't automate that process and do the same sort of thing with this computer software. And so I did, and I worked through a whole bunch of different variations. And a colleague of mine saw this, and he says, "How did you do that?" And so at that moment, I said, well, maybe a software company is going to be born here. And so we tried, there were some geeky computer magazines available back in the early 80s. And so I put an ad or two, and the rest, as they say, is history. I've been selling the investment analysis software ever since. What I found and what that colleague noticed was that I could make a much more comprehensive and intelligent decision as to how to structure this deal in terms of price and terms by going through a lot of different variations in a short period of time. Whereas in the past, each one of those variations via paper and pencil would have taken me about 4 hours.
Yeah, so you're really pioneering developing real estate investing software. So is it that experience that really helped give you a name and give you material and give you the confidence to publish the book, What Every Real Estate Investor Needs to Know About Cash Flow? And that's how I first found out about you and how I think a lot of people have.
Well, the book deal actually is kind of a funny story in a way. I had absolutely no intention of writing a book, no thought of writing a book.
Huh.
I'd been writing blog articles, or that was before there were blogs, actually, simply articles that were posted on our website. One day I'm sitting here in my office just minding my own business, and I get a phone call from an editor at McGraw-Hill. Now, I wasn't smart enough to realize that when somebody calls you from the 70 whatever floor on 6th Avenue in Manhattan and asks you if you'd be interested in writing a book, you're supposed to drop to your knees and say, "Yes, thank you." Now, I gave the guy a hard time. He said, "Well, okay, I'll tell you what. I'm going to send you a book that we had published once before, and why don't you take a look at it? I think we might want something like that." So I got the book, took a look at it, called the guy back, said, well, I've been dealing with real estate investors for, at that time, I think it was 20 or 30 years. And I looked at the book, and I think I can identify out of the tens of thousands of people that I've dealt with in the real estate investing game, I can identify 3 people who could understand the book you just sent me. By the way, I'm not one of them. So how about I'd write something that I think is a little bit more approachable, something that people could understand. again, I'm giving the guy a hard time, not realizing that I have just, fallen into a deal that if I had called him and asked him if I could write a book for this major publisher, he would have not been able to stop laughing long enough to hang up on me.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way,
No,
typically.
it doesn't work that way. But anyhow, the long and the short of it is, I guess I hit the right tone and the right content because, as you mentioned at the outset, this book now has been on Amazon since 2004, almost always in the top 5 or 10 in real estate books, and it continues to sell. We just, in fact, I just did a third edition that they released just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, that's terrific. I basically would consider the book probably the best real estate investing book I've ever read that defines the numbers and what all these calculation metrics are. And you sprinkle just enough humor in there to keep it quite readable. I guess starting at the beginning, so, how should an investor begin when they're evaluating a potential income property investment, since it is largely about the income?
I think where an investor ought to begin is to decide to roll the movie back about one reel and back off a little bit and to do something that I suggest to my grad students at Columbia. And that is I devote a half a lecture usually to the subject of clarity. And one of the aspects of clarity that I emphasize is before you start investing in this particular property or in any property, understand what your objectives are. What are you trying to accomplish before you undertake the investment process? I think it was the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland who said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And then Yogi Berra improves that, by the way. He says, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. So if you don't know where you're going with your investment, you're not going to be a successful investor. So think about first, are you looking for an instant home run? Are you looking for ongoing cash flow, a value add opportunity perhaps? Are you trying to build up long-term equity? Maybe you're thinking about your retirement or funding your kids' college education. But whatever it is, start there and decide what is it you're trying to accomplish, because that will help you understand whether the property that you're looking at squares with your investment objectives. Then the next step is your due diligence. Even before you get really involved in running the numbers, as I explained, I think both in my book and in my teaching, the due diligence has to start with market research. You're going to buy a property that does not live in a vacuum. It lives in a place. And when you do that, you have to understand what that place is. You have to understand what are the financial dynamics in that particular marketplace. You need to know where the cracks in the sidewalk are, because that way you'll understand what is the business climate, what's the tax climate. Are people moving in or people moving out? Is there going to be greater demand for apartments, greater demand for small retailer offices, or is demand going to be diminishing? Once you've gotten done with focusing on what your objectives are, perhaps focusing on whether you want to do residential or commercial, focusing on what the market due diligence tells you about the place, then let's start turning over the rocks and looking at individual properties and start analyzing those individual properties.
Yeah, that's totally appropriate. I've said a number of times that the property in residential real estate investing, often to me, that's only the fourth most important thing. Number one is you. What kind of investor are you? Are you a cash flow investor? Are you investing for appreciation or tax advantages or lifestyle investing? Second's the market. Third's the team of professionals. And probably only fourthly is the property.
I think you're absolutely correct. And that's where, unfortunately, a lot of beginning investors just kind of try to jump over the first three steps and say, okay, I decided today I want to be a real estate investor. Let me start looking at some properties today and see what you got.
Yep. And you're like, whoa, back up a ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Once we think we have secured what works for us, we have a market, we have a competent team, why don't we dig in a little bit? Like, tell us about analyzing a real estate deal, especially regarding the income stream.
I think the income stream, the notion of the income stream, is one of the most problematic items for beginning real estate investors to understand. I tell my students only half jokingly, I ask them, how many people here, these are grad students, and a lot of them are not newly minted grad students. A lot of them have been around the block in investment banking or development work or that kind of stuff. And so I ask them, how many of you folks own a home? And invariably several people raise their hands, and I say, well, here's the bad news. You are at a disadvantage because everything you think you know about real estate is not going to apply to what I teach you now about income producing property. Because what you know about residential real estate as a totally market driven phenomenon, where the value of the property rises and falls depending upon general rising tide lifts all boats kind of logic, where comparable sales drive the value of the property. Well, people don't buy single family houses typically for their ability to produce rental income. They buy income producing property, such as multifamily properties, larger apartment buildings, retail, office, self storage, whatever. They buy those for their ability to produce income. And it is that income stream that drives the value of the property and the success of the investment. So getting back to the comments that you made when we started off about all I really want is a beautiful building with Greek Revival columns.
Right.
That's exactly kind of the mindset that most beginning investors bring to the process. They have a very difficult time switching gears and saying, what I'm really looking at is a future income stream, and that's what I'm buying. I'm not really buying the physical asset. I'm buying the physical asset only in terms of how that physical property is more or less successful in producing an income stream. So the same logic goes into the old saw about what's the most important thing in real estate: location, location, location. So I tell them, well, guess what? When it's income producing property, that's almost true, but really not quite true, because you can have something in a great location, but it can have a terrible lease structure, which means it's a bad investment. So location only matters to the extent that it impacts the income stream. The beauty of the building matters to the extent that it impacts the income stream. So you have a beautiful building with a lousy income stream versus an ugly building with a fantastic income stream. Guess which one you ought to buy?
The one that supports the better income stream.
Absolutely.
Sometimes I see investors have a holdup. We're talking about crossing that bridge from being a primary residence real estate, quote unquote, investor, if you really want to call it that, to crossing that bridge to being an income property investor. One emotional component in shortcoming I see some people have is, oh, I wouldn't buy that building unless it's nice enough to live in myself. And I find that very limiting. So I think when one crosses the bridge from a primary residence owner to an income property owner, we're kind of extracting emotion and replacing it and injecting calculations.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right on the money there. No pun intended. You have to kind of get yourself away from the emotive content of the property. And that's a mistake that I see is very common among beginning investors. They're looking at something, I feel I can be comfortable with this building. I really like the looks of this building. I feel like I could be attached to this building for a long time. I try to tell them, you're not picking a spouse, you're picking an investment.
This is not the place to fall in love.
Right.
You made an interesting comment a couple of minutes ago about lease structures. Tell us if there's a building that might be able to support a good income stream, but yet there are faulty lease structures.
That's part of your due diligence, really, is to look at the leases that are on an existing building. An example that I give my students in trying to decide between two competing investments is two virtually identical buildings that are side by side, and one has leases that have periodic escalations. It's an office building. And one of them has periodic escalations in the leases, but the other one, don't know what the owner was thinking. Maybe he was renting it to his brother-in-law, but it's got a long-term lease on it for the offices that was perhaps at a fair market rent when it was written just a few years ago. But going forward, the rent is not going to be increasing on any kind of regular periodic escalation. And so when you look at that as a long-term investment, it's not going to look so great because the leases now have your hands tied in terms of the future income stream. Whereas the first property, the future income stream, is fairly well defined to kind of track with what you're hoping is the progression of value in terms of lease space in that community.
Yeah, I bought a property before, and it was a 12-unit building, and all of the leases were 6-month leases. So what I had to do was kind of discount that in my mind a little bit, because I know when I wanted to buy it, I wanted to transition everyone to 12-month leases, and people will often pay more for a 6-month lease flexibility on a per-month basis than they will for a 12-month.
Then, of course, if you're on a very short-term lease terms, such as those, I assume that you're talking about apartments. That means that you have an offsetting, you got a benefit on one side, but you have an offsetting cost on the other side. Your turnover is going to require a good deal more property management, a good deal more hands-on effort to keep the place occupied, because every time you turn around, you've got more vacancies, coming up that you've got to deal with.
That's right. With 6-month leases, that wave of turnover is coming sooner, and few things are more expensive than that. So, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see made by novice investors?
There's a whole bunch of them, actually, that I could tell you about. Let me hit kind of the highlight reel. One is jumping in without spending any time on basic education as to how income property investing works. As we talked about before, they'll skip those first couple of steps that you mentioned and try to just get started. And the result of that is that they don't understand the vocabulary that is particular and specific to real estate investing and real estate investment analysis. And by getting the vocabulary wrong, they do a couple of things, all of which are bad. If they don't understand how to calculate, for example, what are and what are not truly considered operating expenses, what is net operating income, how is it defined and how is it calculated, they'll end up coming out with an erroneous estimate of the value of the property because they'll have the numbers scrambled up. Perhaps even more importantly, if they don't get their vocabulary correct, straight in their head, they set themselves up to be viewed as an amateur, as a newbie. They might as well wear a sandwich board that says, "I've never done this before. Why don't you go ahead and cheat me now?" And I've seen this very, very often where they will invent terms that do not exist in nature. And they'll make up terminology. And that kind of earmarks an individual as a beginner, as an amateur. And so when you go for financing or when you go to negotiate with someone, they say, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And so I think we're going to have to, factor that into our negotiations or factor that into our financing proposal, that we're dealing with somebody who doesn't know the deal, doesn't know how the deals work. Another common, at least what I consider an error, and there's not universal agreement on this, is looking for what is the latest hot market so they can go and buy in that hot market. Some years ago, I think this was maybe 2 or 3 real estate bubbles ago. By the way, this is how real estate investors reckon time. It's kind of like the ancient mariner. They reckon it by real estate bubbles. Anyhow, this was 2 or 3 bubbles ago, and I was out in California giving some lectures. And when I got to the Q&A part of my talk, I must not have given a very good lecture because nobody wanted to talk about what I had just told them. They all wanted to ask me if I knew where the best neighborhoods were to buy in Las Vegas. Well, they didn't know anything about Las Vegas. I knew absolutely nothing about Las Vegas. But they were all set to go buy property there without knowing anything at all about the territory. The old line from the Music Man musical, you got to know the territory. Well, they didn't know the territory. I think it's very important to know the territory. As I mentioned before, I think it's important to know where the cracks in the sidewalk are, because then you have a visceral sense for what's going on in a particular market. You really have a feeling, if they're having a hard time renting that store over there, maybe I should be paying attention to what's going on here. And when you are kind of confining your focus to a territory with which you are intimately familiar, then you not only know the territory, but the territory knows you. You become a known entity in that market. And so you may get wind of a potential deal before somebody else does. Of course, we talked about the mistake of falling in love with the property rather than doing the analysis. But there's one more I want to bring up, one more common mistake, and that is that assuming the information that you get from a seller or broker is both correct and complete. It may be that the novice investor will think, okay, I want to check these numbers. I want to verify that the property taxes that you've told me are in fact correct or this sort of thing. But more egregious error that I see them making is assuming that the numbers that they've gotten are the whole story. And very often, they're not the whole story. For example, do you live in an area where it snows? Well, has snow removal, if you have a parking area or sidewalks or whatever, has snow removal been included as one of your operating expenses? Are you going to keep the books yourself? Are you going to do the tax return for the LLC that you formed all by yourself? Or are you going to hire an accountant? That's an operating expense. all these little things in maintenance. Are you going to do preventive maintenance on your HVAC system? Very often, novice investors assume that what they've been told about the operating expenses is the complete story. I always encourage my students, and when I give them case studies, the thing that I really try to do throughout the semester is that put yourself in the deal. Forget that this is a homework assignment and make believe this is real money.
Right.
You are dealing with real money now, and you're going to potentially buy this property. And when you do buy this property, you have to think, now I am a real person inside of a real deal, inside of a real investment situation. What am I really going to have to spend money on? Very often, the information you get is correct insofar as they've given you the right numbers for the items that they've told you about, whether it's the seller or the broker providing you, a workup on a property. But they have no obligation to tell you about things that you didn't think to ask about. So have you thought to ask about these other considerations? What does it really cost to maintain this property? What does it really cost to do all of the things that you've got to do to keep it running properly? And if they haven't told you, then you've got to put yourself in the picture and say, okay, now I am the owner of this property. What's coming out of my checkbook, really? And then when you do that, you will come up with a more realistic net operating income and perhaps a more realistic estimate of value.
Yeah, those are some great points to bring up. To that early first-time buyer, unless it's tax season, they're probably not thinking about who's going to do the books when they're about to close on the building. If it's August, they're not thinking about snow removal.
Exactly right. But in my part of the world, we had a blizzard here last weekend. That was nothing compared to last winter when it seemed to snow about every half hour. And not that far from here in Boston, my son happened to be up there. You could barely see the buildings, let alone the cars, because it had snowed 4, 5, 6 feet in a matter of a couple of weeks. Now, if you own a building up there, you have a serious consideration to deal with in terms of keeping that building accessible to your tenants.
Yep, there's a new definition of a snow day for you when you're a real estate investor.
Absolutely.
You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is Frank Gallinelli. More when we come back. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Through Get Rich Education and International Coffee Farms, you can own your own half-acre parcels of a passive income-generating coffee farm in Panama for as little as $18,000. It's a low-risk opportunity with an average annual return projected at 12%. The farms are professionally managed for you on a turnkey basis, and you own the land. To learn more, visit internationalcoffeefarms.com.
Are you looking for a roadmap to financial freedom? If so, we have a solution for you. Norada Real Estate is offering a limited number of free strategy sessions to help you get out of the rat race. Learn how you can create wealth and build monthly passive income. To set up a time with one of our knowledgeable investment counselors, simply go to noradarealestate.com. That's NORADA realestate.com.
This is Rich Dad Advisor Ken McElroy. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education with our guest, Frank Gallinelli, president and founder of Real Data Software. So, Frank, what is the time value of money? Why don't you tell our audience about that?
It's the concept that a dollar received today is more valuable to you than a dollar that you receive in the future. And this is really intrinsic to the successful analysis of any investment, whether it's real estate or anything else, and that you can't simply look at the number of dollars that you acquire from your holding of a particular investment, but you have to look at both the number and the timing of the returns that you receive. I do an example with my students where I have a property that does tremendously in the first year versus another property that doesn't do quite as well in the first year, but does reasonably well, perhaps even a little bit better in subsequent years. And when we do our rate of return analysis on these two properties, the one where there's a home run almost immediately turns out to have a better rate of return than the one that you have to wait and take your return in dribs and drabs, even if the total dollars of those dribs and drabs is greater. And usually folks scratch their heads trying to figure out, what's going on here. And the reason, of course, is that the timing is equally important as the amount of the money. So if you have to wait a long time to receive your return, or if your return comes to you in rather small increments over time, it may not be as valuable as return that is front-loaded. So time value of money is essential to analyzing any investment. You need to take a look not just at the total dollars, but at the interplay between amount and timing on those.
Well, the early dollars are the more valuable dollars because they're dollars that can be reinvested sooner.
That's absolutely correct. If you get a return on money today, as opposed to getting a return on investment today, as opposed to a return on investment in a year, you can take today's return and earn yet more on it. So that by the time you get to that equal point in time, a year from now, you will have earned a greater return in terms of total dollars.
So that's one perspective through which we can analyze how a property is going to perform. And that might go into our overall picture, Frank, into when one's purchasing a piece of real estate. I mean, just what is the best way of determining what a property is worth? The seller's going to have their asking price, but how do you know what is the right price to pay and what the most that you should pay is?
Well, actually, Keith, that's kind of a trick question because there's the issue of worth, and then there's the issue of value or price. Now, as readers of my book will understand, because I beat this topic practically to death, you start off by calculating the net operating income of a property. Then you try to find out what is the prevailing market capitalization rate, what is the prevailing rate of return that other investors are achieving for similar property in a similar location. You apply that cap rate to the net operating income, and you obtain a market value. Now, this is the approach that an appraiser will take when they estimate the value of an income property. And please do notice that I say estimate. There is no such thing as determining the value of a property. There is art as well as science in this. And so when you try to do this calculation, what you are doing is coming up with a reasonable and realistic estimate. When your mortgage lender decides how much they're willing to loan you on the property, one of the factors in their underwriting decision will be to capitalize the net operating income. In both of these scenarios, we're looking at the value of a property at a point in time. And that is very useful information. What is the appraised value? What is the market value of this property at a point in time? But as I always try to emphasize to my students, if you're an investor, you're not acquiring this property to own simply at a point in time. You have an anticipated holding period, an investment horizon. It may be 5 years, it may be 7, 10, it could be 20 years. Again, if your goal, as we discussed those earlier, is to fund your retirement or your kid's college education, you could be looking at 15 or 20 years down the road. That's not a point in time. So your estimate of value for today may not be the only thing you want to take into account when you're making a decision in regard to what price makes sense to you for owning this property. Let me try to kind of get out of the theory and then play with an example. Let's say that you're looking at a property and let's say it's a small strip center. And you've got stores there and they've got leases and you can figure out what the net operating income is today. And you know what a reasonable estimate of the capitalization rate is for that kind of property. And you can estimate just as well as the appraiser coming in from the bank as to what that market value is. But you're going to own this property, you've decided, for at least 5 years and probably 10 years. So that's when you start looking at the leases and you start looking at the current occupancy, the current tenants that you have there. And you say, okay, what's going to happen by lease with that income stream next year and the year after and 3 years from now and 5 years from now? What's going to happen may already be predefined in the leases. There may be step increases. There may not be step increases. You may have leases that are fixing to get ready to expire. You may look at the tenancies and say, I've got 2 nail salons in this strip shopping center. One of them's not going to last. I mean, there are only so many fingernails in town. So what you're saying to yourself is, I think I know how it's operating today, But how it operates next year, the year after, and so on and so forth, what kind of a net operating income I may have in those future years isn't going to be the same as today. It's going to be different from today. It may be more, it may be less, depending upon the things that you identify here. Now, that's the income side. On the expense side, you may have to be looking also at what's the life expectancy of this roof. This building has a 20-year-old flat roof. If I'm going to hold this property for 10 years, I'm going to be doing a roof. That may not be factored into your capitalization of the current net operating income, but it needs to be factored in to your long-term estimate of the income stream. So what I'm suggesting here is that when you're going to make an intelligent, informed decision about what makes sense to you in terms of a purchase price for a property, yes, you absolutely need to do that cap rate calculation to see what is its value at this particular point in time. Because, as I said before, that's what an appraiser's job is, to tell you what the thing is worth today, not what it might be worth at some point in the future. But then when you want to look at it from your point of view as an investment, you want to combine that information with what you think might happen with the property over your expected investment horizon. If you combine these approaches, I think you'll make a more intelligent decision. Now, one of the objections that I hear from people when I suggest that you should do a 5-year or a 10-year pro forma projection of how the property will perform, those folks say, well, you can't predict the future. I'm only concerned with what's happening now. Tell me how it's operating now, and I'm going to make my decision based on that. Well, I would respond to folks who say that we're predicting the future by saying, well, if you're going to confine your decision to how the property is operating just today, then you too are basing your decision on a prediction of the future. You're saying that I'm satisfied that the future is going to look pretty much like today looks.
Yep, that is probably really short-sighted.
Yeah, and what I would also suggest and urge, more than suggest, is that you don't simply do a single pro forma projection into the future, but you do at least 3. Best case, worst case, and something in between, the most likely, what you feel is the most likely. In terms of how will the income stream play out over the next 5, 10, whatever number of years you've determined is appropriate for you. If you do that, then you can ask yourself, obviously I can't predict truly down to the penny what the future is going to hold. But if I've taken the boundaries of best case and worst case scenario, do I think I can live with this property on this price, on these price and terms, within that set of boundaries, within the best case and the worst case scenario? Will I be able to still call this not a tragic mistake if I end up with the worst case? And will I be, reasonably satisfied with the in-between? And of course, with the best case scenario, that's the sort of thing that, stories you tell on the golf course are made out of. But can I live within this range? Not that you're going to absolutely predict how something is going to perform, but can you estimate a reasonable range of possibilities? And then can you make a decision saying, okay, within that range, I think this deal will be okay for me. That's, I think, how you have to go about the estimate of determining what a property is worth to you as an investor.
Yeah, that sounds like a very reasonable, rational way to analyze things. As investors and, just as everyday humans, we're all trying to predict the future. We know that we can never do that. I think what you're telling us is when you're informed and you do proper due diligence on a building, you can begin to find clues, some of them close to certainties, maybe with a rent escalator or something, as to what the future is going to look like.
Sometimes my students, I think, look at me like I'm slightly nuts, because I tell them that if financial analysis of an income-producing property is the closest thing that they're going to get to a course in poetry in their finance curriculum. Because I say what you're really doing here is that you're trying to look both at the numbers on the surface and at the story that's behind the numbers. You're trying to parse this almost as if it's a Shakespearean sonnet and say, I understand the words I just read. Now, let me see if I can understand the imagery behind it, the story behind the story. If you can develop that mindset that says, okay, the numbers are important, but I need to understand also what drives those numbers in the background and what may drive those numbers in the future in the background, you'll make of yourself a much more successful investor, I believe.
Yeah, and I think if you're trying to buy a building that way, I think you're really going to impress the seller and the seller's agent that you've really done your homework.
Yeah, you're not going to be wearing that sandwich board I talked about before, that's for sure.
Exactly. A lot of this does come down to what is the cap rate, which is basically the relative profitability of a building, and why are cap rates so different among different regions, at least here in the United States?
I probably could have included that question among the list of things I said that I see beginning investors get wrong very often, and that is that they assume that there is a cap rate that they should be applying to net operating income, and that this is sort of a universal constant, kind of like pi or something. In the past, I think 10% has always been a popular number, but I believe that's only because you don't have to really do any serious math when you use that. You simply move the decimal point over one place and your work is done. But cap rates are like politics. They're very local. They're not only local geographically, but they're also very specific to the property type. So there is no such thing as a universal cap rate. There's no such thing as a cap rate that extends over a large geographic area. And there's no such thing as a cap rate for a given property type, no matter where that property is. So, for example, if you were to look at apartment buildings, the cap rate could be substantially different from one location to another. I know of a location where I owned property once where cap rates were different on different sides of the same street. It's very, very local, and you need to really get kind of tuned in. This is why I said before, investing in locations that you're not intimately familiar with is not something that I recommend, certainly for beginning investors. I know there are a lot of folks who say, go find where the hot market is. And of course, a lot of those folks have been very successful, so who might argue with them? But the fact, I think, also is true that if you don't have this kind of intimate knowledge of a locale, then you're not going to understand just where the cap rates may be likely to shift. And once again, if you think that a cap rate is a cap rate and doesn't matter what kind of property, not at all true. Retail properties in a given location may have an entirely different cap rate from office buildings, which then going, logically forward, have an entirely different cap rate from other kinds of income-producing properties. So you have to be property type specific and location specific, doing your market research there. Very often commercial brokers and certainly commercial appraisers can be very helpful in providing you with the kind of data from which you can derive what the cap rate is at a given point in time.
Chances are you don't live in the market where the best cap rates are. So when you're buying out of market, it just comes down to really leaning on a very trusted team so that they can help you identify those cracks in the sidewalk.
Yes, absolutely. If you're going to venture out of your little comfort zone of information, then you better have people in place with whom you have complete trust to get you that data and that information.
So, I think the listeners have heard some things here about extrapolating a few years out in a pro forma to find out how profitable a property might be. And, maybe they're determining that, these phone apps for determining cash flow for a property, that might be nice for just determining relative cash flow between one property and another, but there might be even more to that. But your software program really goes in pretty deep. And tell us a little bit more about your software program and how that helps investors.
Obviously, this has evolved quite a bit since that first deal back in 80, 81, so that now you can do a commercial lease analysis, residential rent roll. You can do the APOD form. We haven't even talked about that, but the APOD is kind of the starting point for most successful property analyses, basically the real estate version of a profit and loss statement. Cash flow analysis, cash flow projections. We've even now added the ability to do partnership projections, because especially during the great financial meltdown of 2008 and following, it was almost impossible to find financing for commercial property. And so what most of our customers, many of our customers at least, were doing was putting together partnerships in order to be able to acquire property, because in spite of the fact that a lot of the conventional wisdom is, I want to do it my way, kind of the Frank Sinatra approach there to investing. I've told people, is 50% of a positive cash flow better than 100% of a negative cash flow? Maybe you want to get some partners in on the deal, go after less financing, and put together a deal that everybody can be happy with. So we've got that sort of capability within the software, and we even have something we call a decision maker, which allows you to toggle various variables in the deal and see instantly how that affects the outcome of the cash flow, the rate of return, and so on. We try to make the program provide you with the most useful presentation type of reports, and we're working on improving those all the time. So program is now in its 17th iteration, if you will, over these 30 some odd years, and there'll always be another one.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Frank. Well, in winding down here, where can our audience find out more about that and more about you?
Well, you can go to realdata.com. That's probably the best place. And while you're there, I'd invite you to check out also learn.realdata.com. Just recently released a online video and text-based course, mostly video, based on my books and on my teaching at Columbia. So you can get about 30 some odd videos on the topics such as we've been discussing today. You can find me on LinkedIn by my name, Frank Gallinelli, no spaces, Twitter at fgallinelli, or on Facebook at Real Data. If you'd like to contact me, if you go to realdata.com, you can pull down the support item from the menu bar there and send an email.
Well, thanks so much, Frank. You've really put some coarseness and some texture and some meaning behind the numbers. Really appreciate you coming onto the show today.
Well, Keith, I appreciate your having me. It's been a pleasure to chat with you today, and I hope that your listeners will get something useful out of it.
All right. If you want to make a Columbia University professor your de facto real estate investing instructor, you can check out Frank's course at learn.realdata.com. When it comes to investing, you want to buy real estate based on facts and fundamentals, not the emotions and feelings that only come into the equation when you're buying a primary residence to live in yourself. Thanks to the talented Frank Gallinelli today. Until I'm back next week to help you again with perspective on how to build your wealth, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
You've been listening to Get Rich Education, telling you what the wealthy won't tell you about real estate and investing. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to visit iTunes and leave your comments.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.